this is another thing that very few people know, but the fashion industry is responsible from anywhere between 4 and 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That's more than France, Germany, and the United Kingdom combined. It's a hugely polluting industry, and it's really because of these textile mills. Like, the amount of energy required to take a raw fiber like cotton or polyester and spin it, weave it, dye it, finish it, just takes an immense amount of energy. And we're doing it in places like China that still have a coal-based energy grid, and then we're producing in such great volumes that it's amounting to the same emissions as almost the United States.
How can I help? How can I be useful in ending needless suffering? Do not be afraid of work that has no end.
We have to organize a social movement.
We have an opportunity to lead by example versus just talking, hot air. I think the more people in this fight, the more we grow. Eventually it could change. The people are the ones that can make the change.
How much time do you spend thinking about your clothes? Do you ever think about where they come from? Do you ever think about the people that make them, whether or not they're earning a living wage, or the environmental impact of the things that we wear around every day? Would it surprise you that 20% of global wastewater comes from textile dyeing? How about the fact that 93% of brands surveyed by the Fashion Checker aren't paying garment workers a living wage? Another stat from the BBC, 15 million, I'm going to say that one more time, 15 million used clothes arrive in Ghana every week from Europe, America, and China, and fast fashion items make up more and more of what is sent. 80% of global garment workers are women and often earn an extremely low wage in very dangerous conditions. In Bangladesh, many work more than 100 hours per week. My guest today is Maxine Bedat. She's the director of the New Standard Institute, a think and do tank, more than just a think tank, using data and the power of citizens to turn the fashion industry into a force for good. She co-founded and was the CEO of the fashion company Zadie. For its work in sustainability, Zadie was named one of the world's most innovative companies in retail by Fast Company. Maxine began her career in international law working at the Rwandan Criminal Tribunal and received a Juris Doctorate from the Columbia Law School. She is the author of the book Unraveled, The Life and Death of a Garment. Her book gained critical acclaim for its approach. In Unraveled, Maxine Bedat follows the life of an American icon, a simple pair of jeans. Where does it come from? What does it take to make them? How long do we wear them? And then where do they end up? So I have a personal podcast, and this shirt is actually one of the podcast shirts. I'm supposed to be wearing an Ironclad one right now, but I forgot that I didn't do my laundry, so I'm not going to tell them, even though Jesse is listening to us. Sorry, Jesse. I had somebody in the t-shirt blank industry, because one of the things that I obviously print t-shirts on blanks. If you're going to have a t-shirt, you need to have a blank. I had a conversation with broadly somebody who is from the special operations world in the U.S. military, who got out and started a very successful garment company, who explained to me that they can get Chinese blanks, but as long as they do enough steps in the U.S., it was like 3 or 4, that then the blank could then be resold as made in America. And it's still to this day, that conversation shocked me, a way to actually obfuscate where something came from through the legal steps required. And it's like, why would you actually do that? Why, I understand, because you don't want people to think it's from China, but let's not pretend like you're doing anything better. I mean, you might be from an environmental perspective, but you're still lying. So I feel like there's just a lot of room for people to maneuver and not necessarily be truthful about where the garments come from.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, to have a Made in USA label, it's supposed to be primarily produced in the US. But, a lot of folks get around it if they, will do their finishes in the US that will still kind of show on that label. And I think I understand like why the law was created so that we can, support made in America goods. But like by putting one country on there when the industry is so globalized and there's virtually none, clothing coming from farm to shirt, from dirt to shirt, as they say, like in the US, that it's just, it is misleading to citizens as to like.
Yeah. I know of only, I'm sure there are others, but I know of only one company that makes that claim from dirt to shirt. They use slightly different terms.
TS Designs in North Carolina, they do it.
They do, and so does Origin Maine. It's a jiu-jitsu inspired brand, but they have the entire process. They do a lot of lifestyle as well. I'm actually wearing a pair of their pants right now, but all the way from U.S. cotton, controlling it completely inside of that ecosystem, cut and sewn in the U.S., dyed in the U.S., washed in the U.S. It's pretty impressive what they're doing. And I tell you what, I know the founder and owner quite well, and it has been, using his words, an uphill battle to regain manufacturing capability and capacity inside of the U.S.
Yeah, there's just so little, in the 1960s, about 90% of clothing Americans wore was American made, and today that's less than 2%. The clothing we wear is American made. So yeah, it's a huge shift that's taken place in a generation or so, and not something that a lot of people are aware of.
For sure. So when you started looking, the fashion world again hits your radar to some degree. How hard did you have to look at it before you started seeing that there was humanitarian and environmental issues that probably needed to be brought to the forefront and dealt with?
Yeah, pretty right out of the gate. And I just
like instantly.
Yeah, I mean, I just remember, starting to Google stuff and, and reputable sources, I should say, not just your generic Google search. But coming up with these things, it was like hiding in plain sight sort of thing. It wasn't that even the industry was denying it. It was like they were willfully ignorant of their own impact. And I just remember at that time, this was, in 2012, 2013, being like, this is insane. How is this not on the, like, everybody is talking about this. This is like crazy. And it was, I think the food movement had was 10 years ahead of the fashion industry in terms of just like understanding that agriculture has impact. But yeah, I just remember like being alone in a room doing this research, being like, this, like, how is this not on the front page of like every, newspaper? So yeah, it was hiding in plain sight. And I think it was like in the 90s, there had been coverage of sweatshops, Nike and others were implicated at that time. And then like there was a bunch of noise and then things kind of disappeared in my young adulthood. And then, but the stuff was still happening. And then in 2013, so a decade ago, the Rana Plaza was a factory in Bangladesh where over 1,100 garment workers died from a bad factory collapse. And that was when it kind of resurfaced in, well, at least in some corners of public attention.
Yeah. Another stat that they provided to me, 93% of brands aren't paying their garment workers a living wage.
Yeah, that's probably more like 99.9%.
That's what I guessed. And so it's not something that even could be plausibly denied through ignorance. Like, this is obviously an intentional choice.
Yeah, so what's happened is, we in the United States, we fought for some basic labor protections. Of course, I think we could fight for a lot more. In the 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s, we gained some of those protections, and industry responded by moving production out of the United States. Just it kind of started this race to the bottom of finding countries around the world that have the lowest labor protections, the lowest environmental protections. And the garment industry is an interesting one and is so exploitative because factories are pretty easy to set up. The technology is not expensive for cut and sew facilities. It's still a sewing machine. They can be, so there's a low capital outlay. So you can set up, a factory, pretty much overnight somewhere. And so that's why it's the kind of the forefront of this race to the bottom of like finding the places where you can do production the cheapest. And all that means is you're paying workers less. And so that's kind of the reasoning behind why this is an industry that, the U.S. Department of Labor have found to be kind of one of the most exploitative in terms of
How
labor.
do the major brands justify not paying people a living wage? Again, because it's so prevalent, there's no way that you could sit there and say, oh, well, we didn't know. I feel like they all knew, and it's just something that they're willing to tolerate. I'd be fascinated to hear in your experience how they explain away that willingness to pay people far less than that living wage.
Yeah, I mean, if you can ever get them quoted on a response to that specifically, they will say things like, they work with their partner suppliers to, ensure that the garment workers are receiving their living, they're not even attempting to say living wage. They'll say the legal wages. And then they will talk about the code of conducts that they have, which is these agreements that they have with their factories of how the workers are going to be treated. And every time there's a factory incident, they'll say like the factory wasn't like living their code of conduct. But the real problem, and this is, I've, heard so many different times from different factory owners, is you have the fashion brand will say, we care about the workers and we care about the environment and we want you to do X, Y, and Z. That's coming from the brand sustainability teams. And then their like sourcing teams will come in and say, well, we need this to be 6 cents cheaper than it was last year. I will always have this quote in my head from a factory owner who said, if you want to talk to us about a living wage, like you need to talk to us about a living price. That conversation doesn't happen.
Yeah. I actually, fortunate or unfortunate, I'm not sure. I was post-military career, I was working for a brand that partnered with Reebok. And they were making shoes at the time. And I was fascinated by the process. So I asked to go and see the factory. So I went over to Fuzhou for, I think it was about a week. It might have been a little bit less or a little bit longer. It was a while ago now. And you want to talk about eye-opening. Wow. There were some areas that were probably first world standards when it came. It depended on what they were doing with the garment or the piece of footwear specifically. The finishing touches had an area that was much more finished, I guess it would be. But some of the coloring, some of the color of the foam, the injection mold, some of those environments, and I'm not an expert on things that are good for you or things that are bad for you, but I feel like I kind of have a good idea of where I would want to work long-term for my health and where I wouldn't want to work long-term for my health. The farther into the weeds of the intricate pieces, or the farther away you got from the finished product, it got a little wild. as far as what people not only were wearing from a protective perspective, but just from a live an everyday life perspective, to the air they were breathing, to the equipment that they were working with. I'm glad that I got to see it firsthand. I don't know if I would have believed it if I actually just heard somebody talking about it.
Yeah, no, having that direct experience is so powerful because I'm looking at a body of water right now. Like in the U.S., we have environmental protections. They weren't always there,
Yeah.
and they could be better. But we have generally blue rivers, and when you go to these major industrial cities making clothing around the world, like they are black and dead. That there's so much chemical effluent coming in from these facilities that the bodies of water can't support life.
That's actually one of the images that sticks out to me from that trip. We were staying at a hotel that overlooked a river, and I did not go into every building that was around that river, but I think it's safe to say that we were in an industrial area, and they were pushing downstream, literally and metaphorically, the byproducts of whatever it is that they were making. The detritus alone that was in that river, there was everything from, plastics, wood. I think there was like a boat that was upside down. It would be water that you would never want to touch, and there was somebody who was swimming and bathing in it. And that image, to me, I don't think I'll ever be able to forget that. It was unbelievable.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is something you can't unlearn once you can't unsee it once you see it.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a difference between seeing it yourself, which I understand is prohibitive for most people from doing. But I'm glad, at the end of the day, I'm glad that it happened for me, because it makes me more passionate about talking to people like yourself who are at least trying to make a difference. And even in that world, I remember conversations of, it's this brand that is the problem, or it's that brand that was the problem. And then as we were driving through Fuzhou, like we're at the Reebok factory, but right next door is the Nike factory or the Under Armour. You know what I mean? They're all willing participants in the same game. So to say that one is more altruistic than another one, that's a tough argument to make, at least in my own experience from what I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, the truth of the matter is brands share facilities, so they're not, brand-owned facilities.
People don't realize that either. Like a run of Reeboks will end, and then here come the Nikes.
Yeah, yeah. And that's definitely the same in the apparel space. So, yeah, they're all working in the same system, and, some are... I think the reason why the work that I do now is so focused on legislation is brands, even those that want to, like, they can't work alone because they do share facilities with their competitors. And so you have to, a brand that is actually serious about wanting to be part of positive change, in effect would have to kind of by the design of things, be supportive of legislation that requires their competitors to do the same thing, because they all share the same factories. And so if you want, even if you are a good actor, if you're working with other bad actors, you're in the same system. How good of an actor are you if you're working in an ecosystem full of bad actors? Exactly.
Whew. That is a bespoke taste. Good morning, everybody. Today's episode of Change Agents is brought to you by HVMN. Specifically, their product, Ketone IQ. What is Ketone IQ, you might ask yourself? It is a brain fuel. It's something that I use, like I just did. I'm getting ready to sit down for a day of podcasting, and I want clarity of focus. I want a little bit of a push when it comes to my mental acuity and ability, but I don't want to over-caffeinate myself, because this isn't caffeine. These are ketones. And before I even get into what ketones are, I'm actually going to let you do that yourself. Research to your heart's desire. But if you're looking for a clean energy source that has substantially helped me without the post-caffeine crash, I cannot recommend Ketone IQ enough. Again, it's from a company called HVMN. What does that actually stand for? Health via modern nutrition is the answer to that. You can find Ketone IQ at hvmn.com. And if you use the promo code Andy at checkout, you are going to get 20% off. That is hvmn.com. Promo code Andy. One last note. Have a chaser. It's a bespoke flavor experience. It's not that it's bad, but it's not that it's good either. I don't drink it for the taste. I drink it for the effect. To focus it more on the fashion world. Sorry, I brought up the shoe. I guess it's part of fashion, but it was my own personal touch point into what you're talking about. Tell me about your book, Unraveled.
Yeah, so it tells the story of a pair of jeans, a metaphorical pair of jeans, I should say, because it would be impossible to trace one single pair. That information is hidden. But basically what I did was I traveled around the world following kind of a typical pair of jeans. So I started in Texas, in West Texas, on the cotton fields, just speaking to farmers. And, I'm a city slicker, so I wanted to just understand with as little, with as much curiosity, like why farmers are choosing to either go organic or why they're not, and kind of what are their lives like and motivating them. And it really helped me have so much more of an appreciation. As somebody, like, my job is to talk and to write and to think, but I'm not dependent on the weather for my income. And spending time with farmers gave me such a greater appreciation of that. And the stress that entails, and how that, might make, a farmer like more risk averse. So I spent time there, speaking to a bunch of farmers, cotton farmers in particular, understanding, why some are using synthetic chemicals and some are not, and learned about soil health and soil. And then I went from there and I tracked that cotton I went to China to visit textile mills. And it was really cool. The first textile mill that I visited in China, I went in one of their quality control rooms, and they had a map of the United States. And they had the town in West Texas that I was in, because that's like a major supplier of theirs. So, I got to see the indication that I was following sort of a natural path of genes. And it was there that I, really saw those black rivers, and they're caustic too. They like burn your nose.
Yeah.
And I spent time with people working in the environmental space there. They do so pretty quietly, lest they, it's a pretty delicate relationship with the government there, and learn more just about the environmental impact of fashion. And, this is another thing that very few people know, but the fashion industry is responsible from anywhere between 4 and 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That's more than France, Germany, and the United Kingdom combined. It's a hugely polluting industry, and it's really because of these textile mills. Like, the amount of energy required to take a raw fiber like cotton or polyester and spin it, weave it, dye it, finish it, just takes an immense amount of energy. And we're doing it in places like China that still have a coal-based energy grid. And then we're producing in such great volumes that it's amounting to, the same emissions as almost the United States. So so I went, spent time in China, and then I went to Bangladesh and Sri Lanka to follow kind of where the cut and sew of the jeans takes place. So in China, I looked at how that fiber goes to yarn and then is woven into fabric, dyed into denim, and then went to Bangladesh and this is where kind of the most, in the like story of jeans, where the most like people are is at the cut and sew factories, turning the fabric into denim. And that's because, like, I'm not wearing jeans today, but normally I am. If you're looking down at your pants, there are loops, there are seams, there are, the waist seam, and all of that is cut by somebody and sewn by somebody. And so in that part of the book, just seeing these huge production lines of, upwards of 50 people per production line, where at the start are different pieces of cut up fabric, and at the end is the actual garment that, we would wear. And just like the mechanized labor, like seeing these people that are working and they're being watched by their output per second. And kind of just how dehumanizing that sort of work is, and speaking to garment workers in their own homes and getting an understanding of their lives. And yeah, just how, let alone the living conditions that they have to suffer through as a result of the wages, just the work alone is really dehumanizing. And
what type of living conditions did you see?
Yeah, so I visited a woman in her home in Bangladesh, in Dhaka. It's the capital of Bangladesh. It's a slum by any other word. To get into the slum, there's no space for cars, so you kind of walk along rickety sort of side streets, and then she lived in a tin-roofed facility or house that if I stretched out my arms on both sides, I could just about touch the walls on either side. She lived in that house with her husband, and her 2 children. And there was, obviously not a space to sit down. I spoke to her in her room. She sat on the one chair and I sat on her bed. And that is the space she has for her entire family of 4. Those areas are really subject to a lot of fires, because everybody is packed so close together. So if there's a fire in one area, it can spread, and there are regular massive fires in those areas. But that's what she and her husband, who is a tea seller, could afford with the wages to produce from brands that we have in our closets, that I had in my closet. That's what she's afforded from that salary.
Do you think that there is any way that the people who run these brands don't know that that's happening?
No.
Yeah, right. It would be implausible, if not impossible, for them to not know that that's occurring. In my mind, at least. Okay. Wow. Yeah. So you mentioned Dhaka, the slum that you were in. Mm-hmm. What changes, if any, did they make with that garment factory collapse that killed 1,100 people?
So what they did, and this was really the result of labor organizing that happened even before that the factory collapse, is they had tried, organizers had tried to get some of those major brands to sign on to an agreement to make the fashion brands responsible for the safety of factories, and they refused to sign on to it. But when the disaster happened, and there was actually significant media coverage, there was enough then pressure for the brands to be forced essentially to sign on, so they could show that they were doing something. As a result of that, it was the agreement is called the Accord. It made fashion companies basically much more responsible for the safety of the factories that they worked with. And the governance of the accord has union representation. So it's really like a robust kind of quasi-legal mechanism. And as a result of that, the accord on safety, the facilities in Bangladesh go under much more significant safety review. And there hasn't been there still are fires in Bangladeshi factories, but it has become more reliably safe. I think the accord has been seen as quite successful, but it's only about the accord only relates to like the structural integrity of the factories. It's not about their, garment worker wages or other protections. So yeah, it's been successful in that regard. And there's work to expand this thing called accord into Pakistan as well. So to expand these sort of protections. So work has been done subsequently, but it is limited. So it shows that change is possible, but also just how much more we have to do.
Yeah, and it highlights how people oftentimes are unwilling to do anything unless there's a catastrophe. Yep. So, yeah. Okay, back to following your genes. So you're in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. Where'd you go after that?
Yeah. So, and I just want to say why I was in Bangladesh is 80% just to demonstrate how huge these industries are for countries like Bangladesh, 80% of Bangladesh's export earnings come from the apparel industry. So it is a huge part of the Bangladeshi economy. And then after Bangladesh, I went back to the U.S. and I spent time speaking to Amazon distribution workers, following, now that your jeans have been made, they're probably going to go to a place like an Amazon distribution facility. Spending time with Amazon distribution workers, and this was right before the pandemic, I should say, was very eye-opening because of that mechanized labor that I was talking about, that like you're being tracked by the second. That was very much similar kind of work. And just understanding at a more deep level just how stressful and dehumanizing that work was important for me to see. And then what I should add is, I also got to do history research in this, and the whole idea of mechanized labor. And by mechanized labor, I mean labor where you are measured by your output per second or output per minute or output per hour. That got its start in the American South in the time of slavery. And so we're still like using the same exploitative tools for humans, which was I think revealing and something we need to think about as society. And then from there, I spent time with New York Department of Sanitation, looking at what happens when we throw our clothes out. And I spent time at a donation at Goodwill, looking at what happens when we donate our clothes. And then I ended my journey in Ghana, in Western Africa, looking at ultimately what happens to the bulk of the clothes that we donate to places like Goodwill, and looking at the secondhand markets there, and ultimately the waste system in Ghana.
Could you unpack that a little bit more, the downstream journey when somebody decides they're going to get rid of, we'll use in this instance, the jeans that you were following? I don't think it's an aspect that most people spend any time thinking about. It's just, it's gone, so therefore it's gone, and it's, no longer my issue to deal with.
Yeah. So when we throw out our clothes into the trash, it's, going to in the US, it's most likely going to go into a landfill. It will most likely go into a landfill in the United States. And I think I find it interesting. A landfill is like a very big diaper, essentially. So there's like a plastic bottom, and then we just layer on top our trash. And then at the end, like there is some cover on it so that things don't blow away. But they're not, like, I think people often think of them as like compost heaps. They're not. Like, nothing is meant to break down in a landfill. So you could like excavate a landfill and find from 50 years ago a newspaper that you could still read. So they're like not meant to break down. So that's what would happen. Otherwise, depending on where you live in the US, your garbage might be burned for energy. That sounds great, but you're burning trash, which is has major environmental implications. And otherwise, if you donate to a place like Goodwill, and this was quite shocking, there is such volumes of clothing because now of like fast fashion, there's such volumes of clothing coming in that if your product doesn't sell within a couple of weeks on the sales floor of that Goodwill, it's not going to stay there. It's going to move on. And so when you donate your clothing, first of all, the majority of it doesn't even make it onto the sales floor because it has a hole in it or is stained or is not in sellable condition. But of the clothing that is donated to a Goodwill, only about 6% is sold at that Goodwill. Like 94% doesn't get sold in those facilities. And I think also when we donate our clothes, we think that they're like going to people in need for free. That's not what's happening. They're being sold, and then the proceeds of that sale are going to like fund the Goodwill programming or whatever place you sent it to. And then if it doesn't sell, which it most likely won't in those facilities, the Goodwill then bails those clothes up and sells them to exporters. And then the exporters take those bales, open them up, sort them again into women's summer tops, like winter coats, men's. And then the winter stuff tends to go to Eastern Europe, and the summer stuff goes to different places in the global south, whether it's where I was in Ghana, in Accra, or in Chile, and in other areas. And what's happening there is that the clothing is of such low quality that they're not finding a market there. And again, it's not getting donated there. It's sold. Everything is sold. And so the stall sellers who buy these, they have to buy a container of clothing. They don't get to see what they're buying. They end up, there's very limited research that is done, but one graduate student who's done work on this found that 40% of the clothing that was coming in never got sold at all in Ghana and was just going straight into their landfills. And they don't have as developed waste service. So a lot of it, gets burned and there's, when I happened to be in the landfill at Ghana, it was on fire because of probably some illegal dumping, and the protections that they once had in place. There'd been so much clothing and so much waste coming in that the protections that they once had in place, which separated the landfill into different quadrants, had gone out the window, and that entire landfill by the end of the week was up in flames. And that's, in part from all of our excesses.
Yeah, along those lines, where would you point your average consumer to be more mindful? What would you want to change about how they approach, specifically right now? Obviously, we're talking about the fashion industry because we could have this conversation about vehicles or fill in the blank. But to narrow the focus, what would you recommend to people so they can be the most mindful consumer possible?
It's a great question. So I think two things. One is people tend to think like, well, where should I shop? Right. That's like kind of was always my starting point into this. And I think the most powerful voice you can have is not as a consumer, but as a citizen. And, and engaging your lawmakers and saying, like, what are you doing to regulate this industry? That I think we have so much more of a voice with our legislators, especially the state, local legislators, than people recognize, certainly than I ever understood at the outset of doing this work. And then second, in terms of just navigating shopping, the best thing that you can do is to love your clothes. Like, and if for you, loving it means that it fits you and it's comfortable, like the biggest problem that we have right now is these fast fashion players that are introducing new garments every week and getting us, like, with marketing to believe that we want these things. I've spent a lot of time, as I did in the book, with shoppers. And once you get into even a pretty superficial conversation around it, people, women in particular, are not happy with their wardrobes. Like, it's not a happy relationship. It's very much there's a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety. And it's, I think it's a result of all of these marketing messages that we're, told to buy this thing and this thing and this thing, that we've really lost touch with what we even like and what makes us feel good and what feels good to wear. And that was really my personal journey into this, was like, I had a closet overflowing with clothing and I had a feeling like I never had anything to wear. And I was like, why is this? Like, what is happening? And
seriously.
Yeah. And it was through dissecting, like, putting the clothing in different piles of what I wore and what I didn't wear, and looking at the tags and really trying to understand, like, what is it about the clothes that I don't wear? And it was like, they don't feel good. They don't fit. Like, I never liked them to begin with. And so the number one thing that you can do is love your clothes. Because if you actually put money in the things that you do like, you're going to wear them more. And that is ultimately, from an environmental perspective, by far, the biggest thing that you can do is to wear your clothes more.
When you say fast fashion, is your definition of that a brand or brands? It's like this consistent new offering, like it's just on a cadence that's almost unsustainable.
Yep, that's right. It is a cadence that is unsustainable. And
the FOMO culture, if you will.
And it is completely being, exacerbated by social media and, the influencer economy, when, like, it's their job to sell you things. Like, they are an advertising agency on a small scale. Sometimes on a big scale. And so, it's like the fast fashion company are like the Boohoo, the H&M, the Zara, the Sheins now. And then, kind of coupled with the influencer economy that's like getting us to want to, like, buy.
Buy things we don't need and then feel bad about later.
Yep. And not even want.
Not that I've ever been caught in that trap.
Yeah.
I have to have it. And then it shows up like, who ordered that? Oh, I did. Yeah, because I'm an idiot. Perfect. All right. So I think the mindful consumer, and I love the idea of loving your clothes. There will be people who want to get more involved with that. Or more involved than that, I should say. Okay. Where would you point those people if they're like, okay, I'm going to do everything I can control in my own personal sphere of influence, but I actually want to do more? Where would you point them?
Yeah, so they should go to the newstandardinstitute.org. And if they live in New York, they should go additionally to thefashionact.org. And you can follow us along on Instagram at NSI Fashion 2030. And we can find more information about the industry, about ways to specifically get involved. And then hopefully my book Unraveled can be a resource for folks as well. There's a whole, the concluding chapters on, what people can do and how to get more deeply involved. But I think the Fashion Act can be introduced in other states as well. That's been happening. So even if you're not in New York, you can reach out to your legislators. And we even have a script on the fashionact.org website about how folks can do that to bring this attention to legislators and say, this is not the society we want to live in, and we can address these things. And so, yeah, I think those are the three things that one can do. And I think as a starting point, like committing to reading the book and just learning about it and speaking to friends. I think so much of the coalition building has been from people just having like conversations with their friends and community about what they're learning. And it really is getting just a group of committed people coming together. That's how change has always happened. And that's how it's going to happen in this industry as well.
Yeah, I think it'd be a really powerful exercise for people to just go stand at their closet door.
Yep.
Spend a little bit of time
Yep.
thinking about everything that, could have, would have, should have happened to get to those garments into the closet. It is something I struggle with having to, I literally would wear the same shirt for 7 days in a row if I felt like I wouldn't get shamed for it. But then people send me an ungodly amount of T-shirts or brands that I'll be peripheral to. They want to send a sweatshirt, and at some point you're looking at just this unfathomable pile of stuff. And I want to make, what I try to do is I'll give it to my kids who are now somehow rapidly growing up to be almost the same size as I am, which is actually beneficial and helpful. But that only goes to a certain degree as well. It's something that I think that more meaningful choices and purposeful choices could actually help a lot more. I've asked brands, like, please, actually do me a favor. Like, I can support your brand. I don't need 7 shirts though, because I'm going to tell you right now, I might wear one of them and I don't want to be responsible for that excess and what I would need to do to, responsibly get rid of that excess.
That's such a great way to engage. Like those notes and those messages really do have enormous impact. Now there's a whole conversation because of people like you who've emailed and asked and responded in that way, that like kind of swag from conference swag. Like now there's much more of a conversation about like whether that's necessary or not. It's only from those like very simple emails and communications that conversation starts to happen, and change like happens as a result of that. So it's great that you do that. And we can all find those ways in our lives where we can just, we can push back by just asking the question, like, just saying, I actually don't need this, and not taking it. And the other just like very practical thing, the thing that I did is, and speaking to psychologists about like why habits happen, is I unsubscribed from a lot of the brand like email lists. I unfollowed influencers. So I'm not like getting as many cues as I used to buy stuff. And that it's those
you're not being bombarded.
Yeah, it's like it's not like it's the same, if you want to change your food habits, you avoid driving by the McDonald's, right? It's like make the choice, make it an easy choice by removing those cues to make the purchase to begin with.
It's the perfect ending. If you want to learn more about Maxine and her work and how you can get involved in instituting changes in the garment industry, please visit newstandardinstitute.org. That is New Standard Institute, normal spelling.org.